Our next guest says it's time for Washington to get serious about tax reform and change these rules, which he says hurt the workers, not the companies. We're joined now by Michael Boskin, former chairman of President George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors. So, Michael, you worked for the Republican administration, but you've got to like President Obama's willingness, he says, to look at corporate tax rates being lowered.
Well, President Obama has said on several occasions that he would like to see he's willing to consider a lower corporate tax rate if the base is broad and some of what he calls loopholes are eliminated. Thus far, his main proposal has been to raise taxes on the overseas profits of multinational American companies before they bring the funds back to the United States. We're about the only major country that taxes its multinational companies that way. Most countries just tax the companies on their domestic profits and leave it to other countries to tax the profits overseas. So we'll see if that can be squared. Certainly the incoming chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp, who's very impressive in his command of both the ideas and the practicalities of corporate taxation, is interested in reform, and I think that it's possible either separately or as part of a broader tax reform that includes reforming the personal income tax, perhaps along the lines of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, is possibly in the cards. Tax reform, of course, large tax reforms generally take some time, but we'll see. There certainly seems to be bipartisan interest in the ideas in any event.
Yeah, well, certainly not an easy conversation, but one being had. On the corporate tax rate, I want to talk about what you just pointed out there in terms of foreign profits. Now, international corporations aren't taxed here in the United States until they bring those profits back home. Cisco and others are asking for a repatriation holiday to bring cash back home and lower that tax rate. Do you see any possibility for that kind of compromise?
That's a possibility. Of course, we've done that once several years ago, and a fair amount of cash came back. I think that's a good idea, but there are people who oppose it. So we'll see if that as a standalone item or as part of a small package of items, rather than broad corporate reform in general, could pass. But I do believe it would be a good idea. There's a lot of American cash on American multinational companies' balance sheets that they've earned abroad. Most companies, of course, are abroad because they need to be near those markets for American companies, which, by the way, support American workers here, are selling abroad. They have to be close to the local marketplace to understand their customers' needs and so on, whether that's selling goods or services, from technology to manufactured products.
Michael, I mean, I certainly understand why a corporation would want its corporate tax rate lowered, but for Americans, for economists, when they look at this, we've got, what, $2 trillion in cash sitting on corporate balance sheets. We're not looking at corporations begging for more cash here at home necessarily. What would being able to repatriate do? I mean, how would this truly make a difference? Remember,
for many companies, a large part of that cash is sitting overseas in foreign banks or in similar instruments. Bringing it back here would enable them to invest as the recovery proceeds. It does look like it's picking up a little bit of steam from its very meager early levels.
But they've already got $2 trillion in cash that we're waiting for many corporations to invest.
Some of that, in some companies' cases, a large part of it is sitting overseas. Secondly, they would distribute more of it to their shareholders, who then could invest it and so on, or spend it as they see fit. So I think that it's not doing a lot of good sitting overseas at the moment, and it's likely to stay there, barring either repatriation holiday or a broader reform that lowers the rate and broadens the base and moves to a more neutral system, like many other countries have in terms of where earnings are generated. I also think it's important to point out, because this is generally discussed as really important to companies, and of course it is. But it is also important to their workers. Remember, companies are owned by people. They're owned by investors, many of us through our pension funds and so on. So that's one way. But importantly, in a global economy, our multinational companies have to compete against those from Europe and Asia and other places, and Canada. And those countries have dramatically lower corporate taxes than we have. Our taxes, as you pointed at the beginning, is not only heading to the highest, but it's 50% over the OECD average. And perhaps the most important thing, it's even more over our lower cost or lowest tax competitors. So that means with capital much more mobile than labor, it's ultimately going to wind up affecting jobs in the short run and wages in the long run of American workers if our multinational companies are much less competitive because of our uncompetitive tax system. So we need lower rates, we need a more neutral base, we need a more sensible set of capital cost recovery. The one-year expensing, whatever it's going to do to move a little bit of investment forward because it's you can depreciate it for 1 year in 1 year. That should be part of a broader corporate tax reform that moves us to at least pari passu with the average of the OECD.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate your perspective.
You're welcome, Mark.